Hello, good morning and welcome to the Sunday Supplement. Coming up on today's show, Gareth Southgate saw his England side hammer Montenegro to qualify for Euro 2020. But ahead of their match away to Kosovo, his handling of the Raheem Sterling and Joe Gomez altercation continues to divide opinion. Back at home, the Women's Super League is gearing up for an historic afternoon with big derbies at Anfield and the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. And after a meeting with Premier League clubs, officials decide there's no need for significant changes to the use of VAR this season. Might just debate that. Making the right calls this morning for us, Oliver Holt, the chief sports writer at the Mail on Sunday. Darren Lewis is a football writer at the Mirror, and Jonathan Northcroft is football correspondent at the Sunday Times. Don't forget, you can tweet the show at Sunday Sup, and the best will appear on screen over the next 90 minutes. Now, you might have noticed I'm not, in fact, Neil Ashton. I'm just keeping his seat warm for 90 minutes, so it falls to me to show you the papers this morning. The back pages, starting with The Sun. It's what Neil would want. They think it's brawl over. Gareth Southgate talking about how this is going to make them stronger, the fact they've had this Gomez and Sterling altercation. They're also reporting United closing in on Gareth Bale, signing him in January as soon as that. The Express are going also with Raheem. Gareth Southgate saying that he's one of the best players in Europe. The Observer have an exclusive interview with Vincent Kompany, describing how he's overcome adversity to be the player he is and the man he is. Always great to hear what he has to say. You can always rely on the Telegraph to go big on women's sport, and they've done again Women's Football Weekend. The first ever, we'll be debating that in part 2. And the Mirror, just for you, Darren, more's merrier. Wales on the brink of qualifying for Euro 2020. A big old shootout against Hungary on Tuesday night in Cardiff. Winner takes it all. Now, it's rather helpful that two of our guests have gone head-to-head inadvertently. I don't know if you've been discussing this week. I'm going to write a column saying that Gareth Southgate's done the right thing, and I'm going to write one saying, no, he hasn't. So Ollie has gone with, it's a clever handling of the situation between Sterling and Gomez, and it could be a pivotal moment in England's progress. And our friend on the other side of the table, Johnny Northcroft, has said, no, Gareth Southgate's got it wrong over the handling of the clash. But how wrong will only become apparent in tests of squad harmony further down the line. Now, on purpose, we have not asked Darren in advance because I cannot wait to know which side you're going to take. But, Ollie, just explain why you think that he's got it so right.
Well, look, I mean, I think Johnny and I were both in the same press conference with Gareth after the match on Thursday against Montenegro, and obviously it was a handsome win. We qualified for the tournament, and I think probably what we both agree on is that he, his demeanour was not as positive as it sometimes is. He looked at, given that result, he looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders, and so I think that the Raheem Sterling, Joe Gomez altercation and the aftermath of that, the booing of Gomez at Wembley, had shook him. I think it's been a really big week for them. Again, I think Johnny and I would agree on that, and Darren too. It's probably been the closest thing he's had to a crisis, I think, since he's been England manager. The reason I think he dealt well with it is that we've seen issues of discipline dealt with badly before, and I'm old enough to remember, say, the way Glenn Hoddle dealt with Teddy Sheringham before the 1998 World Cup. He made him look like a child, frankly, and...
smoking a cigarette.
Yeah, for being pictured smoking a cigarette. He had to stand up in front of the press and say sorry, and, he's a kind of proud man. Teddy, I don't think that was a particularly dignified way to handle that. I think that we still don't know exactly what went on with Sterling and Gomez. We don't know the extent of it. We don't know quite what the fallout of it was. And so I think that what we do know is that it would have come out into the public domain anyway. I think Southgate has been criticised for making it public, for dropping Sterling. I think by doing that, I don't want to sound like some sort of PR exec, he got ahead of the situation. I think it's very easy in that situation, again, as we all know, for the media to start setting the agenda, for details to leak out piecemeal, and for it just to become a massive problem. I think he got ahead of it, and most of all, I think that Sterling's come out of it quite well. Southgate didn't humiliate him. He allowed him to speak to. He allowed him to put stuff out on Instagram. I think Sterling, particularly with what he said about Gomez, blame me. I think Sterling's taken responsibility. I think he's shown that he's got it in him to be a leader as well, actually. And so my take on it is that it's been something that can be a positive, something that can actually bond the squad tighter together and help them move forward. I feel that kind of everyone's a winner. Southgate's authority has been enhanced as well. I just think it was the right way to go.
Gary Neville said something similar on Sky this week, hasn't he? The fact that the players would have gone back to their rooms and they would have thought that their leader was weak if he hadn't come out and frankly made an example of one of his better players or done something about it. And the fact that it would have come out anyway. Why do you not agree with that?
Well, what I like about it is the courage he's shown to deal with one of his biggest players and to be hard discipline-wise. And I suppose the best thing that you can say is that Gareth's maintained his authority, I suppose, his leadership, that he will deal with anyone, no matter who they are. And look, as I with Ollie, I agree this is such an incredibly difficult situation for any manager to deal with. And while I think he's got it wrong, I'm not sure if anyone could have really got this one right. It's such a nuanced situation. But my reservation with it, I suppose, there's a couple of things. He had to do something against Sterling. Sterling's the wrong party in this overall. You know, what he did is, I guess, jeopardised the harmony that Gareth has spent 2 or 3 years trying to build in that England team by a very selfish and stupid act. So that has to be dealt with. Whether banning him for a game is the right thing, I have doubts about that. I had doubts about that from the start, because that's seen as a kind of ultimate sanction a manager can take upon a player. And like it or not, I think Raheem's psychology will be, and he's somebody who probably feels he's, throughout his career, not been given a fair crack of the whip by various people in authority or whatever. And I think he will feel that one misdemeanour has resulted in a very public penalty being exercised against him. And while we might think that's the right thing, I think the outcome on his point of view will be a loss of trust maybe with Gareth. But I'm not so bothered about Raheem Sterling, actually. I'm more bothered about Joe Gomez, who I think has come out of this in a very, very strange place, given that he was the victim of Sterling's actions. I think Gareth set out with the best intentions to try and deal with this publicly, because he's tried to be open as manager. But when he got to that press conference on Tuesday, when he was trying to explain his decision, he found that he couldn't be open because they'd agreed to keep the details of what happened private. So he had a very, very odd press conference where Gareth was actually, for the first time I've ever seen him, seemed kind of evasive, seemed like he was reading from PR statements. And what he said, he ended up saying things like, you know, all families have disagreements. The FA statement tried to generalise and say, you know, club emotions were running high. Now, I think that's led to an impression that this was a two-way street. This was almost like a two-way fight. So then we get to Wembley on Thursday, and fans, and I have no idea what the psychology of a supporter who boos Joe Gomez is, but to guess, I think fans decided to take sides, because this impression had then been given by the FA and by Gareth in the way it was handled, that this was a two-way fight and you had to pick a side. So the outcome... I
think that's a stretch, Johnny, to suggest that Gareth is in any way to blame for the booing of Joe Gomez. I mean, well, if the idea that it's a two-way thing, I mean, surely by banning Sterling and not banning Gomez, he made it pretty obvious where he thought the blame lied.
But why didn't Gareth on Tuesday in his statement just clearly say that, you know, there's a victim here, there's somebody that's been, I don't want to use the word assaulted, but there's somebody that's been attacked who's blameless, and somebody else is guilty for this. He didn't clearly state that. I think he didn't because he didn't want to go into the specifics of the incident. However, he left this kind of grey impression. I take the point. The people really responsible are the morons booing Joe Gomez, of course. And this is what I mean about, is there a right way to handle it? This is England, and Gareth probably couldn't have foreseen this being the outcome, but it is the outcome. And I think a bit more clarity, would have benefited Joe Gomez, certainly.
Darren, we've been kept in suspense for so long. I'm dying to know your view on this.
Well, listen, John used the word nuanced, and that just as there is no right or wrong answer, there is no right or wrong side to take, because, as Ollie says, you know, you're talking about in Sterling, arguably, and I saw in your piece, the most influential player, I would say, in Europe on and off the field for the impact that he's making for a generation. But set against that, the decision not to play him on Thursday, lots of ex-pros have said, well, hang on a minute, you've created more problems than solutions for yourself. Would you have done that if we were about to play Belgium, you know, who we've got a poor record against, or a Germany, or a France, or a Spain? No, you wouldn't. So why have you done it in this game? And if you've done that for Sterling now, will you do it the next time it happens? Maybe with a Harry Kane, for argument's sake. I think also, as far as Gomez is concerned, he is a casualty of what's happened. I don't think Southgate is to blame for that, but it is as a result of it, because, as you say, it's been very polarised in terms of club loyalties being stressed and the individual players being the whatever alignment you may take. I think as far as dropping Sterling is concerned, and there is also this element of consulting the other players. Danny Murphy in the Mail on Sunday says today, you know, well, it's a weird way of taking a decision. Really, it should have been down to the manager to take that decision. And if you just take that on, we've all been fairly critical of Unai Emery, for example, and the way he's gone about choosing a captain at Arsenal. You know, if Unai Emery had taken a decision like this, we'd have been critical of him. Now, all that is not to say that we should disagree with and criticise Southgate, because we're all agreed that in the time he's been in charge of the England national team, he's done a lot right. So it's more an observation rather than a criticism, because I think there is a will within the media corps for Southgate to do well. And even, you know, I was at the Grove on Wednesday and we were all sitting around and people were putting to Southgate some of the criticism that he'd had about, if it were a Spain, if it were a Germany, if it were one of the bigger nations, would you have dropped him? He said, well, that's hypothetical. You don't know until you're in that situation. And also, it was put to him, look, you were at Middlesbrough when there was a fight in a dressing room and nobody was sent home back then. And he said, well, at the time I was a captain, I wasn't the manager. And this is a decision for a manager to take. But that said, you look at other clubs, you look at Andy Cole and Teddy Sheringham, you mentioned Sheringham before, Ollie. They played together and won things together. The relationship between them wasn't good.
Yeah, but it wasn't good, but they weren't, as far as I'm aware, they weren't beating each other up. You know, they weren't talking to each other, but they weren't beating each other up in the changing room. And I mean, I think there's an element. I do think maybe the nub of it is who's in charge here. You know, and Raheem Sterling, I think, is somebody that round this table we all admire. And as Darren says, as I've said, he's an incredibly influential player. And in the past, we have had situations, particularly when Sven-Göran Eriksson was in charge, who Johnny went to see recently, but where he appeared at least to be in thrall to his star players. Yeah. He appeared to be in thrall to celebrity, and he appeared to, you know, the tail was wagging the dog a little bit.
All the ex-players say that, who played under Eriksson, say it was like that, especially with Beckham.
Yeah, and I think, you know, probably the last thing that Gareth Southgate wanted to do was to be confronted with a situation where Raheem Sterling, where it was him against Raheem Sterling. I'm sure it was absolutely the last thing. And I think the fact that he did what he did, and we can argue about whether it would, you know, what effect it will have, what lasting effect. I mean, that's a very important point. Yeah. What lasting effect it will have on Raheem, I don't know. But I think, nevertheless, it was probably important for Gareth to stand up to that, make a stand, do what he did, show who's in charge. And I think if he hadn't done it, then maybe his authority would have been damaged.
Well, they've got any number of managers who have had similar situations. All these ex-pros talking about this is so common, it happens so often. How many times does it get into the public domain? And although obviously the guys at you know, Sammy and Matt Hughes did a terrific job on the story, but this comes down to Gareth obviously doing his job and journalists doing their job. You know, and Gareth's
probably
job
one
is
thing we can all agree on is the fact that he'd have been criticised no matter what decision he'd made.
But I don't think it's criticism, though. Does it
he's saying, well, I would have done that. Well, Rio Ferdinand's
criticising
Gary Neville's not taking the other side. We are going to have to move on and talk about some actual football. We've got a couple of minutes to talk about England because they're playing again today. Of course, they've qualified. And in terms of positions who are not yet nailed down, or positions in the team, midfield, who's going to partner Harry Maguire, for example? Where are we standing with that? How much work is there still to do for Gareth on that front?
Well, I think there is quite a lot of work to do at the back and in midfield, which is fairly major. But I mean, I think the good thing is we've been talking about Raheem, but I mean, up front we have got such a sort of embarrassment of riches, really, that is, you know, we look terrific going forward. I think Harry Winks is a you know, that is one of the issues, and that's one of the issues that will probably haunt us a little bit, in that we keep looking for that. We haven't quite got that pivot player that a lot of the best teams have got. And yeah, defence is an issue. I mean, I like Maguire and John Stones. I'm a big fan of John Stones, but I think it's fine beating Montenegro 7-0. It's another thing if we make mistakes against top teams at the back, as we have had a little bit of a habit of doing, we're going to get punished in the tournament.
That's a difficulty for England. I mean, Gareth was telling us in our briefing about how he's going to try and arrange friendlies to almost stress test England, because the difficulty, as Ollie said, is you can put away Montenegro 7-0 and Bulgaria 6-0, but England have had a problem when the pressure's come on in difficult games, either away from home or against really good opposition. So I think it's between now and the Euros trying to put as many situations to the team as possible to kind of harden them back up.
Because there's that dilemma as well, isn't it? Because we think 5 games left between now and the Euros. So there'll be the temptation to experiment a little bit. But equally, you've got that dilemma there of wanting to build partnerships. The 2 centre-halves, you want to make sure, if you, in your mind, you're thinking, well, they're my... or it could be 3 at the back, of course, in a 5. The balance between experimenting and trying to nail down those partnerships, difficult
Well, you
job.
mentioned Danny Murphy before. He's done in his column today, he talked about protection for the back 4, because that's what we don't have as an England team at the moment. And then, obviously, if you have that, then you've got to think about whether you play with a 4 or with a 3. I think if you talk about the strong teams that we've come up against, we've been weak against those teams. But also, if you look at Montenegro on Thursday night, yeah, we were fantastic going forward, but we gave them a couple of opportunities that a better team would have taken. So it's definitely defence, the area that we need to focus on, because in the final third we've been superb, and I would say I think we would still be fairly good against stronger nations. But in midfield and at the back, there are so many questions that need to be answered.
Plenty for Gareth Southgate to think about. It was such an easy job being an England manager, wasn't it, on all fronts? Talking of England managers, we might just talk about Phil Neville after the break, but primarily we're going to be talking about the inaugural Women's Football Weekend, which sees derbies at Anfield, first time Liverpool women have ever played there, and also at Tottenham against Arsenal this afternoon. That should be fun. When we come back, we'll talk about that. We'll be talking about the Premier League and the title race and VAR in a little bit, so stay tuned for that. But now we're going to talk about the inaugural Women's Football Weekend, which has been set up for the first time. The aim is that it's going to be an annual affair by the FA to try and give some focus and shine a light on the women's game at a time when we're not all focused on the Premier League. So it is a men's international weekend, of course. The idea being to grow the game, to get more bums on seats and to give it a bit more attention. It certainly would in terms of the newspapers. I'm just going to show you yesterday, there was a huge amount of coverage in all the newspapers, but the Daily Telegraph did an 8-page pullout with all sorts of interviews, stories that a lot of people won't have had a clue about before, which is, I guess, the idea of journalism, right? Tell people things they didn't know already. Yeah, I thought so too. A big thing with Casey Stoney there, Kelly Smith, they've got all the big names in. But virtually all the papers, super fan at Arsenal, I have to show you this, Maria. If you've ever been down to Boreham Wood where Arsenal play, you can always hear her belting out amongst everybody and how to buy tickets. But it's been in virtually all the papers yesterday, most of the papers today. This coverage of the women's game, is it here to stay, Ollie, do you think? Is it really helped by this kind of women's football weekend idea?
I think so, Jackie, yeah. I hope it's here to stay. I mean, I suppose that depends on how, successfully we keep growing the game and how the FA keep... I think the FA are doing a terrific job at the moment. I think this weekend is a good idea. I mean, I think... I think marketing is important. I think it's important. It's a clever idea to do it on a weekend when there's no Premier League. But I think we are getting to the stage now where women's football is demanding coverage. I mean, a couple of weeks ago when England played Germany at Wembley, I decided to go to that game rather than to go to a Premier League game because I thought there was professionally, just whatever I might think personally about the women's game, professionally I thought there was a legitimate reason to do that. It was going to be the biggest crowd of the day, and we can all make arguments about, well, yeah, but it was only £15 or however much it was to get in. There's 77,000 people there watching a football match. It's legitimate to go and cover that. There were 31,000 people, as you know, watching a Manchester City-Manchester United game when it was played at the Etihad Stadium at the start of this season. It's legitimate that there be a lot of column inches about that. And I think that we are seeing... you and I were talking earlier about the fact that last night even there was a record crowd seeing a French domestic game in Lyon yesterday, Lyon against PSG. I was in Australia recently. There was a record crowd watching a women's game in Australia, the Australian national team in Sydney. There are records being set all the time. The women's game is on the rise, and you know, a lot of men seem to feel threatened by that, and there are pockets, if we're being kind, of chauvinism within the men's game, and they don't like the rise of the women's game. But to answer your initial question, I think it is here to stay, and I think we should embrace it.
I actually think, excuse me, it's part of a wider shift in our media. I think the last 12 to 18 months we've seen probably the biggest transformation in the landscape of the makeup of the media we've ever seen, in terms of diversity. I know, as you said, talk about chauvinism, there are some people who are so stuck in their ways that they can't accept that there needs to be greater representation in the women's game, reporting on the women's game, in the women's game, reporting on the men's game. In terms of black and Asian representation within the game, there are lots of people who want to stay in yesteryear rather than accepting that there is a sport that needs to be covered in the right way. You've highlighted a couple of newspapers there, but I think right across the media spectrum, you look at radio stations like BBC London, who are reported diverting a female show devoted, I'll get that word right in a second, time and energy and commitment to the women's game. You know,
TalkSport this afternoon doing a whole show on it.
Absolutely,
yeah.
TalkSport have got a whole day. They treat it like they treat game day in the men's Premier League. And obviously you've got influential individuals like Anna Kessel and others. I mean, there are so many that we could name, but who are giving the energy and devoting the space to the women's game that they should. And I don't think we are anymore at that point where we should be or could be complaining about the energies and the will to devote time to the women's game and space to the women's game, because you've shown just a snapshot of the coverage that the game has had and is having and will continue to have from this point on, because there has been this acceptance within our game that we've almost been far too insular, and we need to actually represent the many people who watch our game.
Sorry, Johnny. One other point I'd like to make, Jackie, and I think that I'm certainly guilty of this. I tend to spend a lot of time when I talk about the women's game talking about bigger picture stuff, like the stuff I just said about records being set and all that kind of thing. I do think it's important as well that people like me, you know, when I went to that England-Germany game, you know, we talk about actually what we're watching and the football that we're watching. Because so, for instance, the bits that stick in my mind about that game, OK, there's the crowd, and that was great, but is Keira Walsh's cross for England's goal, for Ellen White's goal, seeing Marizan play for Germany. You know, I think we have got to the point with the women's game now where you go and watch a women's game and you go and you watch good football, basically. And, OK, there are some things where the game is still evolving. You know, as, again, we were discussing before, that's not really a surprise. It was banned for 50 years. So but there are an awful lot of things to admire, football things to admire when you go and watch a women's game. That cross from Kira Walsh was a great cross. It was a great piece of football skill. Watching Marizanne play was a real treat. It's worth the attendance money. I think it's important to make those points when we're talking about the bigger picture. There's a smaller picture too, and the smaller picture looks good.
And of course, it's easier to be talking about things like this when we've got the Women's Football Weekend, which is the idea, isn't it? So that we are all talking about it and people are all going and shining a light on it. It's the same with World Cups and Euros. Traditionally, I've covered the women's game since 2004, and very little interest there, apart from only major tournaments. So it's how you get it more on a weekly basis. And of course, there are individual journalists on national newspapers now, aren't there? But how do you make it a bit more widespread so that it becomes a matter of course that a story's a story, it's on the back page if it's a big story?
That's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I think we were at the 2007 Women's World Cup together, weren't we?
China, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was in an era where there was a sense that, yes, the international stuff, the tournaments are important, but there was no real idea either in the mainstream media or I think the FA and the authorities of how to grow the game outside of that. So I remember that tournament involving this big crescendo of England getting to the quarterfinals or maybe second round against USA.
Yeah, quarterfinals, yeah.
Record, it was put on the BBC, there was a record TV audience. The game fell flat, and afterwards everyone just went off back to their respective newspapers. The players went back to their clubs to play in front of almost nobody, and there was no real sense of what to do next.
Well, they went back and I did a story on the fact they'd only been paid £40 a day to be away for 8 weeks, and that they couldn't actually pay their mortgages and rent and what have you, and had to work full time. So it's not very long ago, is it? It's only 12 years ago. So credit to the FA for what they've done with the central contracts and making it more of a spectacle now. As the argument then, was it really a TV spectacle?
And this is I mean, this Women's Football Weekend's been very well judged, I think, in the sense they've found a gap in the fixture calendar for the Premier League. They've tied it in with a men's international weekend, dovetailed it nicely, and it's probably at the right time of the WSL season. It's got going. It looks like a very good competition at the moment with 4 or 5 teams at the top, and the debate about putting the games in men's stadiums, I think, as a one-off or as a kind of occasional thing until you build up to the point where the crowds are going to demand playing at Anfield every week or whatever, is a good thing. I think at Liverpool today it's £5 to get in and it's free for under 16s.
So on the one hand, that's great that people can go and watch Liverpool women play at Anfield for the first time, but the problem is there are no more tickets left because they've only allocated certain stands to it. Right. And so if you're watching this, you think, I'm near Liverpool today, I quite fancy going to watch Liverpool-Everton. You can't, and it's not going to be full. It's maybe about 15 or 1,000. So it's not perfect. It's not perfect, is it? And maybe it costs too much to put on to open all the stands and to steward the whole thing. But I guess it's working.
I think isn't that one of Casey Stoney's arguments? I think is that it costs a lot of money to do these things, and she'd rather that the money was spent in marketing and in trying to fill up the stadium where Manchester United play at the moment at Leigh. But I mean, I think we've already, as far as I'm aware, reached a situation where there have been more fans through the turnstiles already this season than there were for the entirety of the last WSL season. So, and even without, I think, the boost of the games at the bigger stadiums, attendances are on the up. I mean, I think if we're talking about where progress needs to be made, it is in attendances. It's building from. That's where Casey Stoney's right, and other managers in the WSL are right. You've got to build from the bottom up as well. And so, I think City got 31,000 for that game against Man United. The next week, I think they got 1,800 against Birmingham. And they've got the top attendances. I mean, lower down, I think Everton, who have to play at Southport, are getting 360 people at some games. For coverage to be, for that situation that you were talking about where coverage starts to be on back pages and then more and more coverage, we have to start, those attendances have to start going up. It has to be built from that
I think
level.
another of the things that Casey was saying was about whether the benefits of playing in, the lack of benefit of playing a big stadia that's not full compared to a smaller stadium where there is lots of atmosphere. And you think of people who support teams outside of the Premier League, lower down the pyramid, and when they fall in love with the game, they aren't at these glitzy, glamorous stadia. They are at smaller stadium that aren't necessarily plush or whatever else, but they fall in love essentially with the game rather than, you know, the surroundings of it. And I think I would actually be sympathetic to the idea that even though the game might not be played at one of the bigger stadia, it is still something in which we take an interest, as you were saying, about the actual game itself rather than all of the numbers and all the politics.
And if you were going
it.
to Kingsmeadow today in Kingston, where Chelsea play their home games, they've got Man United today. I think that's going to probably be a sellout as well. The atmosphere there, when you're there, you're not going to be thinking, I'm covering women's football.
Absolutely.
It's going to feel like a big game. But then they did the Chelsea-Tottenham game, opening home game of the season. They had the issue there that they sold out all the tickets or allocated them, but because there wasn't a huge price on the ticket, then some people didn't go on the day for whatever reason. So it is a work in progress, isn't it? But from a journalist point of view, I mean, just tell us, because there's our opportunity to hear from you. What do you, and be honest about this, be brutally honest. What are your desks telling you about coverage of the game? Does it come down to individuals saying to your editor, I really want to do this story? Or how does it get allocated?
I mean, I think at the moment there's a willingness, certainly my desk, and I think most desks, to try and grow coverage, just for selfish points of view as much as anything else. You increase your readership. This is a growing sport. If you can tap into it, which the Telegraph are trying to do, then you get more readers. That's what newspapers want. I think there's an openness to it, but I think maybe the point you both made is maybe there's not a full understanding, and I'm not just talking about my paper, but maybe across the board, maybe us as mainstream male journalists, we're trying to understand, but our knowledge, as Ollie said, you know, has to be based on the small stuff and not the big stuff as well.
So maybe some of the specialist reporters helping on that front, getting the stories with the contacts.
I mean, I look at Grant Wall, the Sports Illustrated football writer. I follow him on Twitter, and it always fascinates me that Grant will tweet equally about the US men's team and the US women's team. And he's not doing it for effect, he's doing it because that's his job, because covering football or soccer in the US means being across both equally. And that fascinates me, that's a point that we
that's down to the history as well, isn't it? They've got a history there.
Just on the back of that, I mean, I think it's very similar with the women's game to the men's game in so much as personalities and individuals will drive the stories. You've got Becky Spencer, for example, playing today. Obviously came through at Arsenal, gone to Tottenham, you know, the story behind her is fascinating. You've got the situation of Phil Neville, obviously, and results not going his way in charge of England, and him being judged by the standard he'd set for himself in terms of the progress of the national team. I think it's all about individuals rather than where we go in terms of what our desks tell us. We can drive it.
And a word on that, we're almost out of time, so Phil Neville's done quite well, but we haven't actually got around to talking too much about the England side. But, you know, you were there and you asked a question to Phil after that game. It's 2 wins in 8. That was a defeat at home to Germany, the one against Czech Republic in midweek, conceding 15 goals since that thrilling 3-0 win against Norway at the World Cup. But some of the problems have been the fact that Phil Neville's been describing his couple of performances of outstanding, whereas people who've watched them were query that. But he changed his stance last Saturday, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think the World Cup was a real positive, I think, and I think that, you know, there's, as you say, that Norway performance felt like a real step forward. It's not been great since then, yeah, I think Phil made a couple of missteps, and he seems to have put that right now. We got a scratchy win. And I think there was bound to be a little bit of a sort of relapse after the World Cup, a little bit of an anticlimax, and I think Phil deserves a chance to try and move out of this bad patch and take us through to the Olympics.
Yeah, certainly no clamour to get rid of him or anything like that, but it hasn't looked great in the last few months. But he has got the She Believes Cup to look forward to in February and March, which is a big one for him. And also a big signing by the FA, by the way. It was done in the Mail today by Dominic King. The fact that they've re-signed Dawn Scott. Now, to the rest of you, you're thinking, who's Dawn Scott? But she is probably the best sports scientist in world football, women's football. She did an amazing job with the United States, was with England, and it is a massive coup coup for the FA to get her back. So that's a positive for the England players, or they're going to be worked even harder. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the Premier League title race. Of course, we haven't been on air since the last match. See you in a second. I had to stop these three talking about women's football all the way through the race. We're going to talk about men's football now, lads. OK, there's a Premier League title race going on. Just a reminder, if you're joining us late, where have you been? Sleeping? Wonderful idea. Some of the back pages and some of the supplements. More's merrier, so Kiefer Moore helping Wales to a shootout against Hungary on Tuesday night for a place at the Euros. Vincent Kompany in The Observer talking about overcoming adversity. Plenty, as you might expect, on the Southgate situation with Raheem Sterling and Joe Gomez. We've had Ollie talking about Southgate making the right decision, and Jonathan thinks no, it wasn't. And the Sun talking about the brawl there, talking about if it was a brawl, and about Gareth Bale potentially on his way to Manchester United in January. Shall I get the mirror just for you?
Go on,
just to make you happy, Darren. Oh, look, it's about Raheem Sterling again. What a huge surprise. There we go. So that's the back pages in International Weekend. So, Premier League title race. Is it still on? Is there a title race? Is it between two clubs? Is it between Liverpool and Manchester City? Or are there another couple of big names likely possibly to win it?
I think it's still on. I think you can't rule out... You can't say a title race has ended in November, I think.
We're not even a third through.
Well, exactly. And I think there is so much to factor in. We've seen from City's previous form under Guardiola that they can put together a stunning run. We have to find out whether or not Liverpool will rest on their laurels, whether injuries will play a part, suspensions. You simply cannot say at this stage, despite the healthy lead that Liverpool enjoy, that the title race is over.
I don't think anybody's saying it's over as such, are they? But is it likely that Manchester City, if we focus on them for a moment, are going to come back and topple Liverpool? Do you expect them to?
Well, the short answer is no, actually, but it is possible because, as Darren said, Guardiola has been able to put together incredible runs before. They won last season by just reeling off the wins relentlessly. So, of course, they've got that in their makeup. They've got the quality in their squad to do that. But the reason I think it's really difficult for them is, essentially they're not the Manchester City of last season. Defensively, particularly, they're not the Manchester City of before. And they've got this weakness that is going to keep haunting them until they can get Laporte back and maybe make a signing. And it's almost for them a case of getting through to that point in mid-January in some kind of shape to then try and put pressure on Liverpool. As you saw that at Anfield last week, City played really well. City actually, probably in terms of using the ball with a better team, but were counter-attacked to death by Liverpool. And there's a softness in the centre of that City team that means I think that they'll find it difficult against Chelsea. I think it just means that kind of relentless run of form, your team Wolves did it to them as well, Jackie. I think it's going to be really, really hard for City to be as kind of consistent and grinding as they've been in the past because of this soft underbelly.
Does it come down to injuries as well? Because we know the situation with Manchester City and the problems they've had, but if Liverpool were to get injuries to one or two of their key players, particularly from that front three, could that be one of the deciding factors, do you think?
It could be, and I suppose when I think about that Liverpool team now, I think of Firmino in particular as incredibly important, and we saw what the lengths they went to make sure that Fabinho was available for the City game, and that proved to be a very wise decision. I mean, he's becoming more and more influential. So you're right. There are lots of things that can happen. I agree with both guys. I think that the race isn't over by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that Johnny and Darren both know this more than me. Is it 1 in 50 Liverpool have lost? They've only lost once in the last... Yeah. So to think that they are going to, with the advantage they've got now, to think that they're going to lose 3 times or drop that I think is slightly fanciful. I think the other thing, Jackie, that we can't quite process at the moment is the pressure, because it's been so long since they've won the title. There's so much yearning.
We don't talk about that much, do we?
No. There's so much yearning for it in Liverpool, and the closer it gets, the more that pressure is going to weigh. And as we've all said, City are more than capable City are still a wonderful team. They have got that soft underbelly that Johnny's talking about at the moment, but they are still capable, I think, possibly when Laporte comes back, of putting together a run that will put pressure on Liverpool, and we'll find out. That will be when the real test comes for Liverpool.
Ollie, you mentioned a potential injury to one of the attacking players, but the player I think they need most is Van Dijk.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that it would be him if they were to lose him, because he gives them so much organisation at the back, and he provides that platform for obviously the team to express themselves. But it's been since his arrival at the club that they've had that organisation that has provided that platform for everybody else. They were without their goalkeeper, and Adrian came in and was perfectly capable. But it's Van Dijk who is that key man. We've seen at City, without their two centre halves, they've been weak, and without company, weaker still. But I think without Van Dijk, if Liverpool were to lose Van Dijk, that would be a massive problem for me.
And Ollie touched on there about the psychology of it all, because we do all kind of bang on a lot. You can't help it, the fact that they haven't won the Premier League in its current guise, but with such a weight of history and tradition and winning Champions Leagues, of course, left, right and centre. But did that 3-1 win over Manchester City, do you think that really helped them in terms of psychology? Because they don't want it to be too close, do they, coming towards the end of the season?
Well,
because of those factors they can't quite quantify now.
Last season they had that big chance to open up an even bigger lead than the one that they had, and they blew it. So they needed to make amends for that this time around, which is exactly what they did. And it wasn't... That game against City wasn't like the one against Manchester United, where everyone expected them to go into it and really be ruthless and taking advantage of all of Manchester United's weaknesses. They respected them too much, but there wasn't that respect on this occasion. They went in there, they went for the throat. They were impressive, they were organised, they were ruthless. And I think they didn't just get the points, but they made a statement in that match. And I think in the wider context, it comes down to not about numbers. It comes down to, as you say, the fact that they haven't done it for so long. The closer they get, will that impressive record stand up? Will they be able to cope with the pressure and the expectation and the excitement as they get closer towards it? And that's why I think you can't really be talking about whether or not they are, it is over or whatever, until around about Easter. When you look at that picture, then you can see. But until then, because City have a manager who knows how to win, who's been able to get through tough moments, I think it's got a long way to go.
And we have to talk about Leicester and Chelsea. We're only talking about those two. For people watching, going, hang on a minute, what about Leicester and Chelsea? You're above Man City at the moment. Of course, it's because those two played last weekend, and of course last season, and all the rest of it. But Liverpool have an 8-point lead over Leicester and Chelsea, and it's 9 over Manchester City. So, I mean, we talked about how amazingly Brendan Rodgers has done this season. It's your geographically local team, isn't it, these days? I mean, how do you think they compare now to when they did what they did 3 years ago?
Well, they're a better footballing side. They're a more complete side. They've got more talent coursing throughout the team, and I think they're actually capable of getting a higher points total than them. I think they're roughly on track, but they won the league with 81 points. I think they could do better. Whether a better side, I mean, I think you can't underestimate N'Golo Kante, the form that Mahrez was in then. Incredible partnership at the back, Huth and Morgan, which really gets forgotten about. I think you could say that this team is equal of, and there's an argument for saying that Leicester are currently playing the best football in the country. Some of the goals they're scoring, the sort of team goals, passing goals, are just extraordinary. I don't think they're going to win the league, but I wouldn't have said I didn't think they were going to win the league in 2015-16.
Well, you didn't.
I didn't.
You're the only one who didn't.
But I moved there eventually. I think the reason is that they aren't going to get into the 90 points, which you know that Liverpool can and that Manchester City can. And I think, there's just a general squad strength thing that might make it beyond them. And there's always the question about what happens if Jamie Vardy gets injured. Although that's been the question with Leicester for about 5 years, and Vardy, just like some incredible machine, keeps going and keeps getting better. But I think Leicester's an incredible story, given the challenges they've had as a club. To come back 4 years after the title and be almost as good, if not better, is just unbelievable.
In every kind of department, aren't they? They're strong, fantastic. And what about Chelsea, a team that a lot of neutrals seem to actually quite like these days? It's really new territory, isn't it, for Chelsea fans, having other fans actually quite like them?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's a huge testimony, I think, to the job that Frank Lampard has done. I mean, I think at the start of the season, everybody, well, I thought it might be a bit of a free hit for him. Just, you know, play the young players because they haven't got as much of they haven't got a chance because of the transfer ban, and that, okay, if they're not doing very well, that we can give him a pass because he's got excuses. That hasn't happened, actually, and I think that, you know, the way that some of those young players have stepped up when they've been given a chance, Tammy Abraham in particular and Mason Mount, you know, has been incredibly impressive. And the job that Frank has done in melding them together and in just changing the whole atmosphere around Chelsea. As you say, the idea that actually people neutrals actually quite like them as a team now. The idea that I think if there was one thing maybe that they lacked in their glory days under Abramovich and when Mourinho was there, for instance, it's something that you might say we bang on about, but is that lack of identity. You know, they were a wonderful team, but apart from JT in particular and Frank, I suppose, they didn't have that idea of an identity. They had a sort of looser identity. That's something that's changed now, and I think those almost irrational things are incredibly important to football clubs.
I was at the game before the international break. We spoke afterwards to Mason Mount, and he was saying that prior to the match, prior to the Crystal Palace win, the players were watching their under-18 team play against Tottenham beforehand, and he was talking about the fact that under Lampard there is an energy that spreads right through the club, not just through the senior team, but the younger players as well. They're excited about the idea that there is a pathway to the first team now. We've seen it obviously other clubs like Spurs, but at Chelsea, the players realise that there is something worth fighting for. So it isn't just about the 5 players that are in the first team. Tomori's done tremendously well. Reece James was frighteningly impressive against Crystal Palace as well. I think he could shoehorn Cesar Azpilicueta out of the first team. But I think it's also about the players that are now knocking on the door. It isn't now about the money. And that might be a big reason why so many people admire Chelsea.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to cover the FA Youth Cup matches. And, of course, they'd win, at least get to finals, but win frequently. And have Ray Wilkins alongside me. And you'd have 1 or 2 pundits who'd come to do some of the matches and say, oh, no, it's a massive step up. Doesn't mean they'll be any good in future. But you had Ray Wilkins going, no, these guys are ready. Give them a chance. You had Joe Edwards in charge and then Jody Morris. And they knew, but now they've got somebody who believes in them. And surely that connection as well, because we're always talking every year about how they haven't had a regular youth team player come through since John Terry. And now they've got these guys. And I guess that can't be bad from a marketing point of view as well, if you've got that whole link throughout the club of the fans seeing this and feeling that passion towards their guys coming through.
There's an extra power to be derived from that homegrown sort of cohort that you can bring through. The class of '92 were a great example of that. I think what Frank's done is almost embarrassed not just previous Chelsea managers, but embarrassed a lot of other managers in the Premier League who've ignored talent coming through. As Dan said, he's not just resting with, he's brought 4 in, that's fine. People like Billy Gilmore are getting chances. James, that sends a message out that this isn't finished. There's a conveyor belt, and they have got that extra thing now, Chelsea, that you mentioned, Jackie. They do have that little bit of identity, I suppose, that they didn't have before, and that is, it's not just getting good players through, it's just making the club better as a whole, and maybe it'll demonstrate to other clubs that there's an added value to bringing through your youth. There's something beyond just the player.
It was interesting when I did the match report. I was talking about. I kind of held back on mentioning Manchester United because I thought that's a bit of a leap. But you look at the quality of those players. They can do anything in the game they want. They're going to be special players, and Lampard and Morris and all their team, they deserve a lot of credit for the job they've done.
Yeah, absolutely, and they are getting it as well, aren't they, at the moment? I just want to ask about the Bernardo Silva situation. He's got a 1-game ban, which will be Saturday, and a £50,000 fine after an FA commission accepted he did not intend a tweet about his teammate Benjamin Mendy to be racist, but it was not a private communication between friends, so the report says. It was his tweet on 22nd of September. He admitted to breaching the rule after comparing Mendy to a character on a pack of Conguitos, which is a chocolate brand available in Spain and Portugal. Thoughts on the £50,000 fine and the 1-match ban?
Well, the FA had to take action. It's consistent with the action that they've taken with other people who they felt have made offensive remarks on social media before. I remember being on here last when the whole thing blew up, and for me, it wasn't about what the punishment was or wasn't going to be. I think at the time there was just this whole debate about whether the tweet had represented offence. And I think that is a wider discussion, because in football we are good at the sound bites, let's kick racism out of football, but we appear not to be clear what constitutes that offence. And we try to find excuses or reasons why the guilty party shouldn't have the spotlight on them. It's not about apportioning labels to anybody, and I'm not interested in any labels being cast on anybody. You can say something or tweet something out of ignorance and not be malicious, and it doesn't really matter how many languages you speak or whether you're a nice boy or whatever else. It's about the fact that you have to recognise that you've said something, and all of us around the table, if we said something that was offensive and someone alerted us to that offensive nature of it, we'd say, oh, I'm mortified, I'm sorry if I've offended you. But instead of, again, we go back to where we started, but instead of saying, look, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, if I've offended anyone, I'm really sorry, and move on, I think they tried to defend their position, and that's what made it bigger than it should have been.
OK, thank you for now. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to debate VAR. We've got about 10 minutes to do it. Think you can squeeze it all in? That's in a moment. Welcome back to Sunday Supplement. How are you enjoying VAR this season? Loving it? Loving it? Well, there was a Premier League meeting of senior club representatives this week, and Mike Riley from PGMOL went along and spoke for just under 2 hours to the clubs. I would imagine largely about the VAR situation. Darren, tell us your thoughts on how that meeting went.
Well, the upshot of the meeting is that we won't see referees going to the side of the pitch to consult monitors, as we all are agreed we think they should. The representatives of the clubs that have gone to hear from the PGL, and Mike Riley in particular, appear to be satisfied with what Mike Riley said, that they're happy with the number of correct calls that there have been, and that there will be more information in the stadia as to why referees are referring to VAR. Well, as you can see from your display behind you, we already have information in the stadia as to why referees are checking, why the VAR is consulting. What we don't have is A, consistency on the judgments, and B, enough clear and obvious decisions. And we've all been at games where there have been what we've thought would be penalties not given, or where we've thought that there were penalties given that shouldn't have been. And essentially, because we're not going to have referees going to the side of the pitch to consult monitors, we will still have a game that is not being ultimately refereed by the man on the pitch. It will be a game refereed by a man at Stockley Park. That can't be right. The referee has to be the sole arbiter of decision-making on the pitch, and he has to get help. And before VAR came in, we had manager after manager saying referees need help. But what we're now having is a shift far too far the other way, where the help is taking over.
And just to clarify, they are going to slightly amend things, aren't they? Instead of just saying checking penalty, they're going to say checking penalty, possible handball or possible...
But will that change? Will that change the status quo? They could check it and still come to the same decision that's enraged us all, and we could still have the same situation. It defies belief that we haven't had any substantive change in terms of the procedure.
But they don't want to do it mid-season because they feel it would affect the integrity of the competition. They've done it this way so far, and it could maybe be changed at the end of the season.
They also, they're hamstrung by IFAB, who at the moment don't allow something like the referee VAR communication to be broadcast across the stadium, which I think would be a start, because what we're talking about here is delays to the game and how that affects the spectator, it affects the viewer at home who doesn't quite know what's going on. So surely the best way is, like in cricket or rugby, to start hearing.
We loved it, the Rugby World Cup.
It's fantastic, you know, and it becomes part of the show. That's something I think the Australians and the Americans are pushing for. The IFAB will have to decide on. I think that would be a big, big step. I think replays in the stadiums would also be a step, although grounds like Anfield don't have big screens, so there's there's an issue there. But the monitors things, I think, is the nub of it, because I had big reservations about VAR, but I thought at least it's about giving referees more information. So when this information is available, you've got to use it. And the fact that they're not using it, that they're not going to see replays.
The reason they're not doing it is because they don't want to extend games. They don't want to so people now are clamouring, but you have to go to the pitch side monitor. But they will have seen the Women's World Cup, which I spent the summer commentating on, with referees going to the side of the pitch. And people are complaining about the delays now, but they'll go over, yes, it can add to the drama if you do it once, but what they don't want is for it to happen 2, 3, 4 times in a game and have 7, 8 minutes time added on. Premier League's a huge global brand, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about essentially is the implementation of VAR. I mean, I'm in favour of VAR. I think anything else is just trying to hold back. You know, we can't turn off the technology. We have to use it. But the way it's been implemented has been spectacularly inefficient. And you know, why Premier League football referees can't go and watch something on a monitor, where, say, in the NFL, they managed to do it, where, OK, there are still controversies about video replay there. They've been doing it for 20 years. But generally speaking, it's pretty smooth. You know, why we have to be different? Johnny mentioned rugby, cricket, tennis. All those sports manage to work really well with a form of video replay. We can't.
Do they have more natural breaks in those sports?
It's pathetic. Well, there are some more natural breaks, but there are plenty of natural breaks. I don't buy that idea about natural breaks. There are plenty of there are enough natural breaks in football for us to be able to use VAR well. It's just
would we be talking about this as much if the VAR referee was overturning the decisions they should really be overturning? For example, you know, the Allaire, West Ham, Norwich, for example, which, with hindsight, they've admitted they should have overturned. Is that more of an issue rather than actually going to see the incident themselves? You just want the right decision, don't you?
But I think I agree with Darren about that. About we need to. Part of the problem is, I think we had so long resisting this technology. Suddenly we've gone from like 0 to 60 in 0.1 seconds. Suddenly we're using it for everything. We're using it for everything. You know, we're using it for these marginal offsides. Yeah. We're using it for handballs. We're using it for red card offences. I understand all that, but we've got to give some form of responsibility back to the referee. The referee needs to be making these decisions. I mean, personally, and again, Johnny's right, IFAB have already knocked this on the head before we've had a chance to discuss it, but the system they have in the NFL, where a coach is allowed 2 challenges per match to decisions, to me, that's the perfect way to do it, because it limits the amount of delays there are.
But wouldn't managers use them tactically?
It puts the risk. Well, I don't think so. No, because you can. In the NFL, they have a situation where you can't do it in the last 2 minutes of the game or something. So we could do something like that. But and also, if the challenges were unsuccessful, there'd be a penalty for that. So there are ways around that, Jackie. But I mean, I just think that the other advantage of that is that it puts the responsibility back on the managers and on the coaches. You know, at the moment, we're still getting the blame, trying to blame the referee, trying to blame VAR. As I say, I think we've spent so long burying our heads in the sand about video replay. Suddenly, we're trying to use it for everything.
The reason the ref needs to look at the monitor is, if you look at the laws of the game, football's laws are so subjective. It's not a black and white rule book. Things like deliberate handball, deliberate is a subjective concept, or a challenge being excessive in force. Again, that's a subjective concept. So a guy in Stockley Park looking at merely whether there was contact, that doesn't solve the issue. It's got to be the referee who was on the field, who had the only one that has got a chance to gauge the force of a contact, let's say, or when it's a handball, the motion of somebody's body or whatever. It's got to be that those subjective decisions are at the heart of the game. So only the person making them can really do it. You can look at a TV and say, well, somebody touched someone else with their boot, but that doesn't mean it's a foul.
Well, they are supposed to be making those subjective calls from Stockley Park. They're not just looking for contact, are they?
And that's the trouble. We're going down this route now of strict liability in football, where any contact is a penalty. You know, any touch of the hand is a handball, and I don't think that's where we want to be. But that's where VAR is leading us.
Darren. But if people just respected referees' decisions in the first place, then we wouldn't be in this situation, would we? Everyone say, oh, we don't just respect the referee, but then people didn't. They heckled and harassed, and he was, or she was, the only one in the middle of the field who couldn't see what millions of people around the world could see. For example, like the Zidane headbutt in the World Cup final, which is really what this is supposed to be all about, not the minute frames of an offside.
It goes back to the word I used before, help. You know, the referees need help, but they don't need somebody to do the job for them. And here we have capable referees who are having the power taken out of their hands by people who are operating, as you say, on strict liability. And I think what I would change is if you talk about delays, if all of us see so many cases where the game is paused so that someone can check a decision, and that pause lasts 2, 3, 4 minutes. And players have told us that's a nonsense. We all agree that's a nonsense. I'd have 30 seconds. If you have to go through any more replays after that, you move on with the game. Straight away you cut down the number of delays that you have in a match, because so often we've seen what appears to be clear and obvious, and we're looking at 40, 50 replays and we're thinking, well, this is getting ridiculous.
Okay.
I think if we are able to work on that basis, we could cut down the delays and we would have a situation where referees quite rightly can use their monitors.
OK, I guess one thing we all agree on is the fact that it is still new in this country. It was new in other countries. They've all had a couple of years longer, but hopefully it will get calmer, clearer, and be for the bigger decisions. Now, when we come back in a couple of minutes' time, we're going to be talking about managers under pressure in the Premier League. West Ham are playing Tottenham at the weekend, and their managers really could do with a win. So the Premier League will be back next weekend. A couple of very, very interesting matches, the likes of West Ham taking on Tottenham and Arsenal at home to Southampton, with all of those managers very much under pressure. Let's talk about Maurizio Pochettino first. Tottenham's form absolutely shocking, particularly away from home. They haven't won in the Premier League since January, which is quite extraordinary. They lost the last 6 games of that season away from home. They were 3rd then, they were 14th now. What's going on there?
Well, I think they've been affected by the fact that some of their players aren't committed to the club. They won't sign new contracts. Christian Eriksen is an example. Jan Vertonghen and Alderweireld also haven't committed themselves to new deals. They're in the final year of their contract. The instability around those 3 key players is affecting the club. Only 3 wins all season, and listen, to be fair, Pochettino himself at the end of last season was suggesting that had they won the Champions League, he too may have taken advantage of his right to consider his own options. So they've had a lot of instability, and their rebuild is only half done. They still do need more than Tanguy and Ndombele and Lo Celso, who they brought in. And Ndombele, to be fair, they smashed their transfer record for. I still think that he is the right man to take charge of the club. And for me, I think it's ridiculous that he is under pressure, because I think when you look at the wider context, what he's done for the club, the way that he's kept them in the Champions League after so long with their noses pressed up against the glass, I think it would be a big, big call to throw him overboard because of what's going wrong. And I think his situation is very, very different to the other managers who are under pressure. Yeah,
no Premier League win and 5 for Spurs. They've lost 12 points from winning positions this season, more than any other club. Is that a tactical thing?
I think it's mentality. I mean, the Everton game sticks out when, you know, that game was there to win. Everton were in such a shambles, then the Andre Gomez thing happens, and Spurs find a way to sort of not get across the line. That sort of instinct, winning instinct that they built up under Poch does seem to have gone, and I think that can only be the lack of 100% commitment Darren's talking about from some players, and maybe a feeling that this band of brothers that Pochettino built, the buy-in's not quite there from everyone anymore. And I think he's got to take responsibility for that, because maybe he started the process by talking about how he might walk away. It's just, experience tells you it's very difficult to get that back into a side once it's gone, and you almost have to start again. And he's capable of doing it, of course. But I look at him and I do wonder how much stomach he would have for starting again, because it is starting to look like it would be a 4 or 5 player in and out job at the end of the season and starting again. And
I think Eriksen, I also feel that Eriksen's incredibly important to that side. Creatively, he's there. I mean, by a distance, he's their main creative sort of influence. And I think if his mind isn't quite right, if his commitment isn't quite right, that really affects the balance of the team in a big way when he's not involved. There just seem to be a few issues like that.
Dele as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Dele Alli has struggled to recapture.
How easy is
form.
it to turn this around though now?
Well, I think the crux is what's been mentioned already, whether how much stomach for the fight Pochettino's got, because I think we all know that he, when he's at his best and he's most passionate, then he's an incredibly inspiring manager. And I feel that it's further to what Darren was saying. It's so recent that they were in the Champions League final, which was such a massive achievement. The game against Ajax, one of the highlights, really, that second leg, one of the highlights of last season. What was an amazing season. For his star to fall so much that people are saying that he shouldn't be there, I find quite hard. But nevertheless, as Johnny said, he's responsible for some of that because he's sent out mixed messages himself. He plays a few games himself about whether he actually wants to be there, whether he might want to work somewhere else. So, I mean, he's the crux. If he wants to be there, I think he can turn it around. If his heart's not in it anymore, then it's only a matter of time.
What about across North London? Unai Emery getting a lot of stick, people making comparisons to his record compared to Wenger's in a comparative period of time. Is he taking them forwards, or is he on the track to being able to take them
Jackie
forwards?
was brought in to improve their defence and also stiffen up their midfield. He hasn't done either. I think that they don't play with enough authority anymore. They've got a world-class attack, not scoring enough goals. I think if you look around the team, they lack leadership, and that comes from him. And the whole decision to give Xhaka the captaincy, I actually look at Emery for that rather than Xhaka himself, because if you know Xhaka, he's had more yellow cards and good games, and I think as far as he is concerned as an individual, that's not being harsh. I think it's very fair. I think, listen, he's had a lot of love since he's gone back with Switzerland, and he's been on social media talking about the appreciation he feels for that love that he's had from his national team's fans. But in an Arsenal shirt, he hasn't been consistent enough.
But also, when Xhaka, fair enough comments you make about Xhaka, but when Xhaka, that having made him captain by committee or whatever, when he then gets in trouble and the fans boo him, Emery Emery doesn't want to know. Yeah. Emery hasn't got his back, and to me that's the worst of both worlds. Yeah. And if you make him captain, you stick with your captain and you support your captain. Instead of which, Emery's just sort of kowtowed to the jeers, and unfortunately, I think he'll soon find out they're coming for him next.
So what are Emery's strengths then? What does he bring to us?
That's a good question. I mean, I think with Emery, you've got to look, if you're Arsenal, it's a rebuild, and you've got to look at him and ask exactly that question, because what you're trying to imagine is what's Arsenal going to look like in a year or two's time when this rebuild's complete. And I don't think we've seen a style of play that's coherent. I don't think we've seen the building of the team spirit. I don't think we've seen a particular improvement in transfer policy. Now, I know that's not all him, but it still seems that they sign attacking players and they don't sign defensive ones. And his communication's not fantastic. So you're left wondering, and he doesn't have a great record of bringing through young players, which is something Arsenal really want to do with the talent they've got. So,
God, you're selling him to us, I'll tell you what. Poor Arsenal fans waking up this morning, I'll just switch on Sunday Supplement to cheer me up.
I just think managers fit jobs, and Emery is a good manager for almost like minding the shop, maintaining something. But I think he's shown himself incapable of building so far at Arsenal.
Do you all agree?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I think it's fair, and I think you've given this guy a job long enough in the job to have made substantive improvements. And I think if you look at the Arsenal team now, particularly given the way they were dismantled in the Europa League final last season, I think since then he should have made big changes. And the one single thing that is an indictment for me is that when you look at the defensive instability they had last season, they needed to go out and address that in the transfer market or coach that team to be more defensively sound. He's done neither.
They brought in Louise.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ollie. Thank you, Darren. And thank you, Johnny, as well. It's been marvellous having your company with us this morning. Still to come on Sky Sports. There are a few rather large qualifiers. We've got Republic of Ireland, Denmark tomorrow. And on Tuesday night, Germany, Northern Ireland. They're going to have a playoff next year, and so too are Scotland. They're playing Kazakhstan, effectively a warm-up match now, but Wales against Hungary is a huge one, a shootout for a place at Euro 2020. And you can see highlights of England's match later on, 15 minutes after the full-time whistle. Don't forget, you can download the podcast from all the usual places and catch up with the show on demand. Neil will be back next week. Hallelujah. 10 o'clock for that. We'll see you soon.